Hello, I'm Molly Brunson, Associate Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures and History of Art at Yale University. I'm welcoming you today to the Humanity Dialogues. I welcome you today as Faculty Director of the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. The Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program has sponsored the event today. The Humanity Dialogues has been organized as a response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is a conversation to reflect on contingency as existence and the critical intertwining of art and politics within societies at war. Today, we're offering the 5th conversation in our series. And I'd ask that you please follow the link in the chat to subscribe to our mailing list so that you're notified of future events. And we in fact have a number of them next week. So please do subscribe to the mailing list. The title for today's conversation is The International Art Market, Moving Assets and Funding the War. And we're very lucky to have as our guest today 3 leaders to discuss this question. Daniel Glazer served as Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes in the US Department of the Treasury's Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence from 2011 to 2017. Glazer also served as Treasury's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes from 2004 to 2011, and the head of the US delegation of the Financial Action Task Force from 2001 to 2011. Glazer is currently the Global Head of Jurisdictional Services at K2 Integrity. William N. Getzman is the Edwin J. Beinecke Professor of Finance and Management Studies and Faculty Director of the International Center for Finance at the Yale School of Management. His research is focused on investments, including the art market. His past work has included studies of investment fraud and operational risk. His most recent book is Money Changes Everything: How Finance Made Civilization Possible. Simon Johnson is the Ronald A. Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT Sloan School of Management, where he is also head of the Global Economics and Management Group. In 2007 and 2008, Professor Johnson was chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. In February 2021, Johnson joined the board of directors of Fannie Mae. Our conversation today will be moderated by my co-organizer of this series, Marta Kuzma. Marta is a professor of art at and the former dean of the School of Art. She spent the 1990s in Kiev founding and directing the Soros Center for Contemporary Art. So please join me in welcoming our guest for today, Marta.
Thank you, Molly. We are addressing today the way that sanctions may be less effective in one area than in the area of the art market. And this is part of the reason why. In 2015, the economist and NYU professor Nouriel Roubini had spoken in Davos about the need for regulation of the art market. And it was because, as he said, it is vulnerable to money laundering, tax evasion, trading on inside information, and price manipulation. And then in July of 2020, the US Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs issued a 150-page bipartisan report that identified the art market both as the largest legal unregulated market in the United States and a significant weakness in the United States sanctions and anti-money laundering regimes. So given these warnings, it appears that these would be available routes for sanctioned individuals to use. And given the art world's lack of transparency and its opaque operations to funnel money. And I'm so very happy that the 3 of you have joined our panel today. My first question would be to you, Daniel, in terms of you can make the differentiation between money laundering and sanctions.
Okay, sure. And thanks, Martin. And first of all, let me just thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. It's a real honor to be here with such a distinguished group of experts. So your first question was about the distinction between anti-money laundering enforcement and sanctions enforcement. And it's an important distinction to make because as you point out, anti-money laundering regulatory laws do not apply in the art world. What anti-money laundering regulatory laws and attempt to do is create, and you use the word, and it's the perfect word, transparency. That's the ultimate goal of anti-money laundering regulation, whether it's with respect to a bank, whether it's with respect to an insurance company, whatever the case may be. The goal of anti-money laundering regulations is to require entities to understand who they're doing business with, require them to have policies and procedures to understand the purpose of transactions, and to report to the appropriate authorities information when they feel that there's some sort of suspicious transaction occurring. That's what money laundering is all about in a nutshell. Now, it becomes infinitely complicated in certain instances, but for the most part, that's what it's about. It's about bringing transparency to the financial system. Now, there are certain entities, certain sectors that these rules do not apply, and the art world is one. And I don't think it's a controversial statement to make that it is a hole in the U.S. anti-money laundering system. Europe has begun to try to bring it under anti-money laundering regulation. It has not happened in the U.S., and it's something that I think is going to be coming relatively soon. Sanctions are something that are a little bit different. Sanctions are prohibitions that the United States or any country would place on doing business with a particular individual, or a requirement that any assets of that particular individual or entity be frozen. Sanctions are not about creating transparency in the financial system. Sanctions are simply a requirement, and they apply to everybody. And sanctions certainly apply to art dealers. They apply to, in the US, they apply to every US person, frankly, whether that person's in the United States or not. So a US person in Japan or in Saudi Arabia or in England is required to comply with US sanctions. What the relationship, though, is that the transparency that anti-money laundering regulations bring to a sector allow sanctions to be effectively enforced within that sector, because, again, people can't hide. They can't hide behind companies. They can't hide behind trusts. They can't hide behind nominees. It just becomes more difficult for them to hide.
If you could briefly recount the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia since 2014, or the brief history on that.
Okay, sure. So in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea and then subsequently invaded the eastern part of Ukraine, there were a series of sanctions which were imposed by the United States and its allies in Europe. It's important to remember that none of these sanctions were endorsed by the United Nations, for the obvious reason that Russia sits on the Security Council. So they do not enjoy the force of international law in the same way that a UN Security Council resolution would enjoy international law. That said, actions taken in the financial, the EU and the US are financial and economic superpowers, and actions taken by them, even short of UN Security Council resolutions, have tremendous impact in the international financial system. What happened in 2014, though, was relatively limited. The US and the EU applied investment, import, and export bans specific to the regions which were occupied by Russia. Certain individuals who were regarded as being involved or benefiting from the invasions were put on sanctions lists, so their assets were frozen, and there was a transaction ban applied to them. Certain sectors within the Russian economy were threatened with sanctions, although significant sanctions were never really enacted under those authorities. And there was an attempt to limit Russia's ability to raise capital, to basically issue bonds gain access to international capital markets. That's what happened in 2014. I actually thought at the time, and I was involved in that thing, in those activities at the time, that I thought it was really tough, and I thought that it was more than Russia was expecting. And I would have said that while it didn't turn around Russian tanks and didn't turn around, didn't halt the fighting in Ukraine, I did think at the time that it deterred Russia from moving farther than it moved. I think I was probably wrong about that. Present circumstances would indicate that that I wasn't right about that. And when you fast forward to last month, to February, when Russia first went into Ukraine again, what we saw, and this was like on a Wednesday and a Thursday, what we saw was basically a repeat of exactly what happened in 2014. Virtually the exact same sanctions were rolled out again, really almost the exact same measures. I was surprised at how light they were. I thought they were probably on the light side of what could have been expected. But if you'll recall, for the month, say the the 2 to 4 weeks leading up to the Russian invasion, all public discussions about sanctions were about what wasn't going to be done. All public discussions was about what wasn't going to be done. SWIFT was off the table. Energy was off the table. All discussions were what was off the table. There was no discussion about what was on. So I think that when the West came out with its sanctions on that Wednesday and Thursday, it was well within what Russia was expecting and well within what they were prepared to live with. And I think that they probably saw it as a win. Something happened over that weekend, and it was absolutely astonishing. It's jaw-dropping. I've never seen it before. I was involved in the development of Iran sanctions. We started ramping up Iran sanctions in August of 2006, and we got to full strength in 2011, 2012, 5 or 6 years. What happened next was over a weekend to a G20 economy.
Thank you. I wanted to as a former, thank you, Daniel, this is fascinating. As a former chief economist of the IMF with many friends in Ukraine, Simon, if you could speak to that or as openly as you can.
Well, I think I can say 3 things, Marta, building on what Daniel's very useful briefing just now. The first is that what we're looking at is what has happened before us. It should be described by its proper name, which is war crimes. President Biden has said that Putin is a war criminal. We've seen similar language coming out from other quarters, and I think people should keep in mind that, you know, the level of horror and the documentation of that horror is on a scale that we haven't seen since the 1940s. And I do believe there are going to be massive legal repercussions at the national, international level going forward for likely decades after this. So these are war crimes. These are off the scale compared to anything we've seen in almost all of our lives. Point number 2 is that, you know, Daniel's right that the sanctions have come a long way. And I think, you know, some of this happens over dramatic weekends, but I think, Marta, we have not yet seen the dramatic weekend in this case. There will come a weekend, I hope it's actually this weekend, in which the sanctions are applied to Russian oil exports in particular. I think it would be relatively easy, Daniel, to apply the kinds of prohibitions on insurance, for example, for oil tankers, that in the case of Iran, removed almost all of the world tanker capacity from the oil lift out of Iran. Once you do that, Marta, it's a completely different story. That has not yet happened, interesting enough, and we can talk about why. But we're here to talk about art, and we're here to talk about the role of art and the implications, I think, that only now begin to unfold for the art industry. And I think there's 3 points there to discuss. One is the association with odious origins of wealth that maybe were not illegal at the time this wealth was accumulated, but now we see it through the lens of war crimes, and we say collectively, oh my God, this is just awful. The second is, of course, the legal dimension, which is wealth that was acquired through those odious means that are now turned out to be associated with war. So war crimes are an interesting. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist, but I would observe, and happy to discuss with any lawyers, that the interesting thing about war crimes is it applies retrospectively. If war crimes are officially determined by whatever legal process on Monday to being happened, that will not cover only things that happen from Monday forward. It'll cover the entire conflict. And I think that's what we're looking at here. So this question of where is the wealth, where did it come from, the origin of it, what can be tracked, is going to be super interesting for legal proceedings of all kinds. But on a forward-looking basis, of course, that also raises this issue, which you and Daniel have already flagged, and Will is a world expert on, which is, okay, if it's relatively hard to track things through the art industry because of the way that market has worked previously, what does that imply for what is going to become attempts at busting sanctions through smuggling oil or other items and getting paid in some form that is not US dollars, because that's going to be very strongly prohibited, I believe, as Daniel said. So what other ways do people have to make payments? They're not going to be taking or offering to make payments in soft currencies that are depending on the whims of dictators like rubles. So they'll be looking for something that has a hard market value. And yes, it turns out, Marta, that your industry is exactly of interest there, and as will be the NFTs, non-fungible tokens, potentially, maybe, if that becomes something that can be handled easily across borders, while avoiding the US dollar system, which is the key piece. So I think we're talking about the pursuing the stock of wealth for reparations. I think we're talking about determining what is and is not odious in this context, and the lack of transparency there's going to be a lot more transparency, I would suggest. But I think on the forward-looking basis, Martin, the key issue is, can you make a sanctions regime effective? Because whatever happens in these coming days, nobody is going to want Russia to be further armed or rearmed through anything like its existing way in which it interacts with the global economy. And so then is art further complicit in war crimes? I think would be the question we might dig into. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Will, in this 2020 Senate committee report that was issued from the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, they spoke of two oligarchs who had actually were able to engage in $210 million in post-sanctions transactions. And that was information made available through the Panama Papers in 2016. So of that $210 million, $91 million of this sum was related to art market transactions. Perhaps you could let us know a bit how that could be done. We know that there are storage houses in Switzerland after purchasing of art during the major art fairs there, but then there's the digital markets and NFTs.
Yeah, sure. Art has always been, in some sense, at the very high end of the market, portable money. Blue chip artists, works by blue chip artists have been used for, certainly since the beginning of the 18th century as a way to hedge yourself in the event that you have to leave the country. Or more recently, a portable means of just moving money cross border. It's just an irony about art, which is, the people that make the art are not thinking that it's going to be used as some kind of alternative money in the future. But indeed, that's what has happened through time. More broadly, the context that we're in is a context of wartime, and people that have studied the art markets, let's say in Paris during the Nazi occupation, found a very interesting thing that was going on. There were lots of art sales. Prices of art went up. The reason for that being, look, people had to find ways of putting their wealth into something they could spindle up and put in a tube and make their way to Great Britain. So, that is one way to look at art, which we all hate to think about, which is purely monetary. But the thing that makes it also something that's subject to manipulation and fraud is the fact that art doesn't pay any dividend. So there's no way you can figure out what's the economic value of art, except whether somebody somewhere might be pleased to have it hang on their wall and pay money for that. So that becomes, it's a valuation problem to begin with, but it's also an opportunity. If you want to set some absurdly high price for a work of art in order to establish value for, let's say, a Leonardo or a benchmark, for a work by a contemporary artist, there are ways that you can try and do that through an auction market, which, though regulated to some extent, is very hard to control instances where the prices can be puffed up for major works. So the lack of some economic foundation and the opportunity that people might see to be able to establish certain works by artists as being extremely valuable seems to be an opportunity for fraudulent behavior, but also behavior that has to do with moving money. The NFT market is really interesting because it doesn't go back that far, but non-fungible tokens, the history of them really doesn't start until 2014 and only appears to have captured the public imagination at the end of 2020. That is the works of art that you would buy with cryptocurrency and store in your cryptocurrency wallet that are transactions verified on the blockchain. There are several marketplaces today that are trading NFTs for millions of dollars a piece. So a little piece of electronic code that might be a cute picture of somebody with sunglasses in it somehow has gone for $2 million, $5 million. Why is that? Well, it's very hard to believe that there's a substantial aesthetic reason for it. It could be speculation about the direction of the future tastes and preferences of collectors. It might be some collectors hedging their bets that this is the new direction of art. But nevertheless, these auctions through which NFTs are transacted, it's very hard for the general public to understand who's actually doing the bidding. You don't disclose who the bidders are. You can't look around in the auction house and see who's holding their hand up. You can't tell if there is one person with 7 different accounts bidding on works of art, bidding on NFTs to push the price up. So this, what we're looking at now is a market which, in some sense, is kind of hard to regulate up front. But as Daniel says, ex post, if people are found to be doing something fraudulent, it's something you might be able to pursue if they're breaking laws about in that way. Long story short, we're hearing messages from Russia about maybe taking payment in crypto. If it was Ethereum, I'd suspect that they're already beginning to think about using some mechanisms to exchange these NFTs and so forth for Ethereum value. Who knows? But we're in a position where it's very hard for regulators and other people collecting information to catch up in real time with the ways that this technology, which is connected to works of art in a strange way, is being used.
And for example, there's a simple example of somebody in the art world who told me the common practice, for example, in Moscow is to purchase a Swiss watch at $250,000, put it on, wear it, travel to Switzerland, go to the same Swiss shop that sells that Swiss watch, and to buy them in rubles in Moscow, and then to come and say that they suddenly don't like the watch and they have to, at a small loss, return money in Swiss francs. So explain a little bit about how that could be done with artwork that is perhaps being kept as collateral within Switzerland, for example.
Well, you mentioned Switzerland. One thing that's interesting about it is that Geneva has something called a free port, which is not it's not a new concept, but it's the idea that you have something that something of value that you bring into Switzerland, but it sits in a port as if it hasn't been actually patriated, so that that means not taxed or something like that. So major collections of art might be the Geneva Free Port has a lot of art in it, and so when you think about that as a almost like a bank, if you will, a storage facility where a lot of very expensive art is. That is something where quite likely, just like Swiss banks, they don't identify who the people are that have accounts. There's no public information, save for things like the Panama Papers, that would allow people to understand where those great stashes of art, of paintings and expensive art might be. But we can expect that the Geneva Free Port is one of them, and the potential for disclosing these concentrations of wealth is really an interesting possibility. The fact that Switzerland went partly down that path of disclosure when with the Russian invasion of Ukraine suggests that might also be the free port there might also be something that would cause pain to the collectors who store their wealth.
I'd like to open that the panelists ask each other a question or comments, because I'm sure this is the first meeting of these individuals, and you may have thoughts as well.
Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really excited, Marta, to have the opportunity to talk to these experts. So you can just step back, Marta. We'll take it from here.
That's why we brought you here.
The question for Daniel is about what I mentioned before, which is the insurance on the ships going in. What I think, you made this very interesting question about, the acceleration of sanctions and so on. And obviously, the sensitivity and nervousness about the effect on global oil markets and so on at various steps. But do you agree? I mean, if we sort of drill down and think about, okay, what are the key measures? What is it that will really make a difference? Do you agree that, given that Russia lifts so much oil by tanker, that most of the large tanker fleets will not go in if they can't get insurance? And most insurance companies, of course, can't voluntarily step back because they have contracts already in place. So you need the force majeure that you get from sanctions, and the key there would be the US, the EU, and the UK, presuming that Norway follows with the EU. So sorry to get a little specific, Marta, but I do have the world's expert here. I want to ask you.
No.
You might guess the whole point is to make them more powerful.
It's a great question. I think we're mixing some concepts here. As far as art goes, look, it's quite simple. Art is attractive to money launderers or to criminals. Because for two reasons, and William touched on both of them, because there's no agreement on price, so they're convenient to engage in what we would call transfer pricing, but under or overvaluing it in order to transfer value, and because there's secrecy in the market. Those are the two reasons. Then it makes them valuable to oligarchs, makes it valuable to drug dealers, makes it valuable to organized criminals. It just is. I don't see the debate on it. Cracking down on that is important for all those reasons, because we want to crack down on oligarchs, we want to crack down on drug dealers, we want to crack down on organized criminals. And cracking down on Russian oligarchs is a way of putting pressure on Putin. Now, we could have a discussion as to whether it's effective or not, but it's at least a way of doing it. What it's not going to do is bring down the Russian economy, which is what the West is trying to do now quite explicitly. Quite explicitly. That's what I find breathtaking, is how explicit it is. And one of the few things that have been left off the table, as Simon points out, is energy. Now, the West is trying to sort of backdoor it by going after the Russian central bank and trying to make it difficult for the Russian central bank to take the oil and liquid natural gas profits and prop up the ruble. So they're trying to stop them from doing that, and they took an action even just yesterday to try to make it harder and harder for them to do that. And that might actually work. A more direct way of doing it is what Simon is suggesting, and going after Russian oil and Russian LNG just head on. And there's a playbook for doing it, because it's what we did with respect to in the case of Iran, and Simon's put his finger on one of it, is going after the shipping. And one of the ways you go after the shipping is by going after their ability to get insurance. And that's one of the ways of doing it. There's a number of ways, and it's an important way. The question really is on how to go after it. If the decision is made to do it, the question is whether you do it in the first place. All the concerns about European dependence on Russian oil. Now, in the case of Iran, there were even concerns in the case of Iran about taking Iran off the market right away, and that's why you saw the significant reduction requirements that were imposed on the international community, actually, frankly, quite directly by the United States. And that's presumably, I would imagine that's the type of thing that they're thinking about right now in Brussels and in London and in Washington. It would be some sort of progressively significant reduction combined with sanctions threats and maybe even targeting the insurance markets.
So I have a question for Will, if I might, Marta.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Go ahead.
What I worry, Will, in this case is a little bit that some of these sanctions are performative, as in, we have the rhetoric and we seize a yacht. Oh my goodness, a large yacht is pursued around Italy or whatever. And I think to Daniel's point, okay, so that is an interesting topic for odious wealth and reparations and so on and so forth. Let's be clear. But in terms of stopping the economy, it feels, it's like it's a distraction almost, and what you should go after is revenue. But I don't know, Will, if you have historical parallels you can think of and analogies or lessons we could draw on from your massive, extensive historical understanding.
I agree with you on this issue, which is, there were oligarchs. There were oligarchs before Putin really came into power. There was a giant, I would call it a big bang, a privatization in Russia that caused an enormous concentration of ownership, legally or illegally, in the hands of a few people. And then Putin famously jailed Khodorkovsky, who was the largest of them, as a threat to the oligarchs challenging his power. So so the natural question is exactly, well, maybe there are more oligarchs now that he's created himself that the sanctions could be hurting his inner circle. But the notion of going after everybody with a yacht, while maybe useful symbolically as a way to coordinate, which shouldn't be discounted actually, public opinion, I agree with you. That's not likely to affect change particularly, and it's the question of the privatization, whether the privatization was a great crime that we should be prosecuting ex post, is a distraction compared to the immediate crucial problem of how to get Russia out of Ukraine and stop killing everybody. So we've elided two problems, as I think you and I both agree on it. Is there any, the historical precedents I think we're talking about really are of the age of modern propaganda, and the discovery, certainly in the 30s and 40s onwards, how completely the understanding can be manipulated through media, means that we're probably we know we're in the midst of a propaganda war that's extraordinary. So let's take the South Africa sanctions. If a financial economist looks at the South Africa sanctions, which one or two of them had, they would have said, well, what economically happened when we were prevented, when these sanctions were put in place, and when companies dropped shares in the stocks of those firms that still did business? Well, actually, nothing at all happened. there was no big stock price shock. The market absorbed those sales very easily. However, what really happened was that it was a tool for coordination of public opinion, public shaming, and that was very powerful. It was just a social channel as opposed to what everybody mistakenly thought might be an economic channel. That would be the historical analogy that comes to mind.
I have a very basic question. How do art and oil intersect? How could that work?
Well, Daniel, do you want to go first?
No, go on, please.
Well, I was going to say, I think to me at least, March, it's looking down the road a little bit and saying that, if you right now buying Russian oil is legal. Let's be clear. There's an embargo on bringing it into the United States. Although there was a grace period on that too, don't get me started. But right now it's legal. But if it became illegal, prohibited by sanctions in some fashion, then there will be oil smuggling. So smuggling of crude oil and refined petroleum products is a standard thing, and there's plenty of it happens out of Iran. So somebody sends in a tanker, they take some oil and oil product. They may take it directly to a country that's willing to take it, or they may transfer it ship to ship off the coast of Malaysia. A lot of this happens, by the way. So payment has to be made, Marta. And if you're paying people in dollars, which is the standard thing in the international oil business, then Daniel's former office will be pursuing that, and you will not get away with that. If you pay people in euros. So how are you going to make payment anywhere along that value chain? People are going to be looking for something that is a hard currency. They're not going to be taking rubles, I would predict. For that. So they're looking for what's your alternative hard currency? Well, it could be Ethereum, as Will said, that's one plausible candidate. It could be rolled up piece of art. That's what Daniel said. It could be other things. But that's what I would suggest, Daniel, is the potential future role of art in that particular part of the situation.
I agree with it, but I do want to just clarify one point. U.S. sanctions are not just with respect to transactions denominated in dollars. U.S. sanctions are with respect to any transaction that a U.S. person engages in. And likewise, a EU sanction is against any transaction a European engages in, regardless of whether it's in a euro or not. So what makes art a convenient or useful way of avoiding or evading sanctions is not that it's not dollar denominated. It's that it's anonymous and it's easy to transport. It has a lot of the virtues of cash. I mean, the same way that you would move cash in a suitcase, you could move an expensive painting in a suitcase. Even probably even easier, right? It's lighter. You could hide it, and it's less obvious to the eye how much it's actually worth. Certainly to a customs inspector at a border, it's not going to look at a work of art and be able to place a value on it. So that's what makes it useful. And some of these paintings become so valuable that you could buy some expensive stuff with them, including potentially oil. I don't think that's a long-term solution for Russia to start paying for oil shipments in Van Goghs, but it's certainly something. It's just another way that criminals, could move money. And again, I think that the targeting of art in the context of Russia is to make life difficult and to go after the elites in Russia more than it is to, as I said, collapse the Russian economy, which I think is ultimately what's going to need to happen in order to turn Russia around in Ukraine.
Well, Will has a book, which I forgot to bring with me, of beautiful old money that is art, right? And vice versa. And some of that presumably, Will, or some postage stamps are so valuable. You could also use those for similar purposes as a parallel exchange of value, right? Daniel, that's what we're talking about.
Exactly.
Marta probably knows a lot more about this than I do, but one of the things you worry about, of course, is the huge artistic patrimony of the country that's been invaded. I mean, when Napoleon's armies went into the Low Countries, it just their goal, one of their goals was to collect and ship out as much of the Dutch masters' works as they could, and also after the privatization in Russia, when people have art but they don't have much money, that was an opportunity for huge collections, of Russian art to be formed. So, I know it's sort of a secondary issue now, but I would expect to hear about, the systematic exploitation of cultural assets as things proceed.
I actually wanted to jump in at that point because this is a question I had for the panelists, and Will, maybe you could address it, although Simon, I was also interested in what you had to say about war crimes and how, naming the thing that's happening as war crimes, in fact, changes the game. And so I wanted to ask a question about another kind of cultural asset, which has been certainly in the art news quite frequently of late, and that is these sort of massive, extremely valuable exhibitions of Russian art that are traveling abroad currently. And I'm thinking of, in particular, the very big exhibition of Morozov's collection of European avant-garde masterpieces that is currently in Paris, and a collection of unprecedented value. They think above $2 billion, although of course you cannot value it. And the concern here about its ability to return to the Hermitage Museum and the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. And I guess my question is that a legitimate concern, or is international art law solid enough that we don't have to worry about it, or Russia doesn't have to worry about it? Or does this sort of the condition of war in fact change that game entirely? Could this be seized as an asset that is necessary? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question.
Since we're still adjudicating the art thefts and so forth during the Nazi occupation, or in the 30s and 40s, it's pretty clear that there's not a solid international law that prevails about art. There are all sorts of hodgepodges of different rules about exporting art and so forth, depending on how old it is and how much countries care about it and so forth. But that's an interesting idea. $2 billion is a lot more than the value of any one yacht. And if it's known to be in somebody's collection who is, sanctioned, you wonder, if London is using one of the oligarchs' houses to put people up from Ukraine as they escape, you would think that an art collection like that has similar potential. Of course, once you start to do things like that, it's the same thing that's happening with the entire global economy right now. Once you start breaking some of these rules, the liberalization of global trade begins to look less likely after the conflict. So, that's the trade-off one might have.
Just to be clear, if there's art anywhere in the world that's owned by a sanctioned individual, and that art is in the control of a European or an American, they are obliged to freeze that. Wow. That's the law, and I mean they could literally go to jail if they don't. If they're knowingly don't do that. I mean, that's a criminal violation if they don't. So it's as a matter of law, it's not a tough question. If it's owned by a sanctioned individual, and you're a U.S. person, you need to freeze it. You are obliged to freeze it. If it's not owned or controlled, and it's 50% ownership is the standard. If it's not owned or controlled by a sanctioned person, then there's no prohibition at all. But if it is owned or controlled by a sanctioned individual, it's quite straightforward.
What about a state Russian institution, right? So these particular objects are owned by the State Hermitage Museum. Is that sanctioned, or they only apply to individuals?
There's the government of Russia as a whole is not sanctioned. Only certain parts of the government, like the
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Well, not yet sanctioned. We're still waiting for we're still waiting for the big weekend, Molly. I mean, I would also suggest, Molly. So I don't know about art specifically, and I'm not aware, but it seems to me that a case could be made to judges in some jurisdictions anyway, that claims will be coming forward against the Russian state, actually, specifically, for damages. And, you know, there's always a question in all these cases, international cases, of okay, you win the case, but how do you claim damages? I mean, there were people who pursued, the Argentine government had a particular yacht that was pursued around the world because there was nothing else easily seized of Argentine assets. So, I mean, I don't think anyone particularly wants to be mean about international art, but I mean, if valuable assets are valuable assets. I do think the bigger issue is going to be the money that they earn from oil and gas revenues, which could potentially be paid into escrow accounts so that you wouldn't take it away from Russia, but a court process, a legal process, maybe a war crimes process to be named later, would determine how much of that would ultimately go back to Russia or Russians or whoever would receive it there, as opposed to being awarded to the victims of just incredible, illegitimate, unfair, brutal violence, right? That's. I mean, I don't think judges in all jurisdictions would necessarily go for that, but I think in some they might say, okay, let's just have these assets sit here, because once they go back to Russia, you're not going to get them, right? Once you make a payment, it goes back to Russia. It's not, but you know, if it sits in an escrow account or is properly managed by some trustees appointed by the court, it doesn't lose its value. It's not being destroyed. It's not. So I think that's something that may be on the table. But yeah, I take Daniel has the big picture right, as always, which is it really matters. You know, who gets sanctioned is the key issue. And right now the West is holding back. And I have to ask the question, Daniel. I have to ask the question. But it's a rhetorical question. You have to answer it. Why? What further atrocities need to be seen? How many more missiles fired at buildings with the word children written in front of them do we need to experience? I mean, are we waiting for chemical weapons, Molly? Are we waiting? Is there a line where you say, yes, if a nuclear device is used, then we're no, I don't think so, Molly. I think we are going inexorably and inevitably to full-on sanctions, war crimes, everything. I would merely suggest we get there a little bit sooner, because every day sooner means fewer innocent people are going to die in Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't disagree with Simon. And Simon, you keep bringing it back to energy, and I agree. They actually referred to me when I was at Treasury as Tim Geithner used to refer to me as Treasury's chief thug, because I was always on the extreme end of these arguments. So I'm with you 100%. But I do want to just point out, William, it's a really, actually, I think, an important point, what they sometimes call lawfare. And that is particularly private litigants getting involved in this sort of stuff. If you have a judgment against the Russian government, and there are certain, frankly, there are certain actors out there in the world who have judgments against the Russian government for one reason or another, you could go attach Russian government assets and then try to and try to get them, and so. I think it could be really interesting as we start thinking about war crimes. There are certain countries, Spain, for example, where you could actually, bring people to court, you sue people for war crimes. Congress could create that cause of action in the United States as well. There's also, so if people want, and you see it in the terrorism context. So like there's ways that you could go after. Say, you could sue or the government of Iran. You could even sue the government of Saudi Arabia if you think that they're responsible for a terrorist act. And then you can go try to attach their assets. I think you're going to actually start seeing it. And I hadn't thought of it until William just said it. But I think you could start seeing that in this context as well.
Well, speaking of things, yeah. Well, I just noticed a question in the chat, Marta, that hadn't occurred to me, but seems to me to be a very good idea that I will carry forward, which is prohibition. So, as Daniel's explained very clearly, you can sanction specific activities, and you can say you're not allowed to insure art. right? And given that the major, okay, you can go to some rogue renegade insurance company in some place that ignores sanctions if you want, but given that all the insurance firepower is concentrated in a few countries that will, where people will obey the sanctions, that would actually, interestingly, Marta, remove insurance from any Russian-owned or Russian provenance, or however you define that. I don't know, Daniel, what the right term would be. With oil, it's easy, right? With oil, it's like, say, Russian oil, any transaction involving Russian oil, you may not provide insurance to that, which would knock out the shipping, but it would potentially affect storage and other activities. With art, I think the progression of provenance would be interesting.
So I have a question. We're about 3 weeks away from the opening of the Venice Biennale, which is one of the largest art events internationally. And there is something where about nations have their own pavilions, and they exhibit within their own pavilions. The land on which the pavilions is situated is owned, of course, by the Italians. What happens, for example, to the Russian pavilion?
Haven't they announced already that they're not going to?
I understand they are not going to, but there'll be other biennials. There's going to be an architectural biennial. What happens to, are they prevented from exhibiting? Does that property get seized?
There's no prohibition, unless you're a sanctioned entity or individual, there's no prohibition on you. So
it's owned by the, I mean, it is guided by the state.
Yeah, but the Russian state is not subject to sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
This Russian central bank is, there's certain portions of the Russian government that are, there's certain restrictions on doing business with the Russian government in the context of issuing debt and things like that. But there's not a general prohibition against doing business with the Russian government or against requiring you to seize assets of the Russian government. Unless you have a judgment, again, as I said, which is a fascinating thought, unless you have a judgment against the Russian state.
So Daniel, I was really excited by what you just described, the possibility that America's got amazing plaintiffs' attorneys and very creative and thoughtful people who might just be excited about seeing this as a way they can help do good in this world, and also be rewarded for taking up the cause. I would couple that with some of the, and this is a question for you. For a long time in the United States, as far as I could tell, you weren't able to sue a sovereign government as an individual. And this came to be a really important issue when the Chinese government defaulted on its pre-revolutionary debt. And it became, the case was, one case in the 80s, I guess, was thrown out because of this issue. But more recently, hedge funds have pursued, I think it's the Argentinian government, or pursued one of the South American governments successfully in court by, in a which I think has set a new precedent that might make it easier. I'm just wondering whether, as you've said to Marta, in this occasion, it's not the Russian government that is sanctioned, but you wonder whether individuals now have perhaps an easier path towards suing the Russian government.
Yeah, I think it's a great. I'm like honestly, the wheels are turning. Yeah. I mean, the U.S. Congress removed a sovereign immunity from Saudi Arabia in the context of terrorism cases. There's no reason why they couldn't remove the sovereign immunity from Russia in the case of the invasion of Ukraine. I think it would be, as I said, I think it would do more than, chasing yachts. I agree. It's a good idea. It's a really good idea. Why didn't I think of that?
I thought you just did before. That's why I
maybe I just did. Yeah.
Feel free to share it with
That's a productive panel.
This is part of the big weekend we're waiting for.
We just started it.
You heard it here first. Could I ask maybe one final question, which takes us in somewhat of a different direction, but it occurred to me as all of you were talking, which is not only the importance here for NFTs because of their medium, but oil paintings, because you can roll them up and take them across borders. The sort of portability question here, Will, this is probably for you first, but I'm wondering, and I know this was certainly the case, say in the 18th century, that sort of valuable metals and gems were what one wanted to travel with. Are we still seeing that? Are we still seeing the kinds of sort of materials, sort of artistic materials, decorative art materials, jewels that can in fact be melted down and made into something else, or transported in a different way that's maybe not, say, an oil painting, an easily identifiable oil painting by a master, but that in fact can change forms in this way? Are we still seeing assets move in that particular medium?
Well, one way to try and answer this as an economist would be to see if a lot of collectibles that were also very portable are fluctuating in price together. In other words, what's the commonality between a postage stamp and a diamond? Yeah, nothing, except if you think about them as easily secreted. And so, I mean, the way you've asked it would be more, that got me thinking about how would I test that theory as opposed to knowing something about, what's going on with the diamond market these days. But I think that, I think actually the Kim Osterlink is an economist who did the study about the prices of paintings during Nazi occupation. And he did include diamonds as another one of these portable valuables. I wish I could remember the exact details, but I think I recall that they also experienced a similar movement. Anyway, that's what one might expect if that theory was right.
Yeah, look, dealers in gold and precious metals and jewels are subject to anti-money laundering regulation. That is a regulated sector everywhere, just about everywhere in the world, and that goes to, again, the African blood diamonds and with respect to gold, I mean, gold is one of the primary ways Iran tries to evade international sanctions, and it apparently is one of the ways that Russia is trying to do it, because both the Europeans and the Americans just clarified yesterday that gold falls, transacting in gold with the Russian central bank falls under sanctions, which again amazes me that people didn't realize that in the first place. But So I think absolutely, both with respect to Russia, with respect to Iran, and with respect to criminals all over the world, gold, precious metals, gems, diamonds are very commonly used to launder money and to avoid sanctions.
So I have a question. Is art the only unregulated economy?
It's certainly the most important one I could think of.
Well, I'm going to put crypto on the list, Marta, for many practical purposes. But I just wanted to say one last thing, if I may. Daniel mentioned blood diamonds, which I think is very appropriate in this context. I would suggest to you, Marta, and to everyone, that Russian oil and gas are the new blood diamonds. And anything that touches, anything and the situation right now is extraordinary. So on the one hand, the West, including Europe, is supporting Ukraine with in many ways, and that's a good thing. But they're also paying Putin's regime more than $1 billion a day for that energy. So they're funding the war and trying and saying that they're trying to help people who are devastated by the war. That's a recipe for perpetual conflict. Okay, that's blood diamonds right there, where you're putting money in on both sides. Anything that touches the blood diamonds, as Daniel said, including all the gold and so on, that becomes impossible to support morally, politically, and economically and legally. And I think if the art industry needs to take a long, hard look at itself and see if it can get ahead of this issue and prevent themselves from coming under what could be, I would suggest, Daniel, quite onerous regulation, given the kinds of potential infractions and attempted violations of sanctions that might materialize, given what we've talked about in this sector. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm not saying I'm recommending it. I'm just saying, guys, pay attention to blood diamonds. Think about that as it's coming. Think about your oligarchic connections. And try to distance yourself as quickly and as effectively as possible for anything to do with war crimes, while recognizing, as Daniel said, that if you are holding and controlling anything belonging to a sanctioned individuals, you already have a legal problem and you need to seek counsel immediately. Wouldn't you say, Daniel?
Yes, if you're doing business with a sanctioned individual or holding assets that belong to a sanctioned individual, you need to see a lawyer.
Okay, so I have and Molly and I well know that there are many individuals who are on boards and trustees of cultural institutions and that help steer and fund cultural institutions. What is their role as board members and trustees if sanctioned individuals are on within those structures?
They need to be removed. I mean, they absolutely, yeah, this is, I mean, again, that's the easy one is the sanctioned individuals. Because you just can't have you can't conduct any transaction with them at all. The harder question, because I mean, how many sanctioned individuals are there? There's lots of rich Russians. And there's lots of, the point has already been made that there's lots of, and their range of complicity with Putin and the Putin regime, there's a whole spectrum of absolute complicity to opposition and everything in between. And how do you deal with all of these individuals? Are we going to say that everybody with a Russian accent, is not allowed to serve on the board of an art museum? It becomes very, very difficult. And if it was in the context of another sort of ethnic group or race, then it would be downright offensive. And so we do need to be careful about it. But the hard question isn't what to do with the sanctioned individuals. The hard question is what to do with the people who are probably bad guys or close to bad guys who aren't sanctioned.
Or who will be sanctioned next week.
Or who will be sanctioned in the big weekend.
Right.
Yeah, I think in practice, every institution that has a board that find themselves in that position are asking themselves what they should be doing right now. They're going to have a range of answers, but you would expect many of them would ask these people to at least temporarily step away until there's some resolution, or ask for a voluntary resignation if it seemed appropriate, or an explanation as to why they're they're on the side of the justice as opposed to supporting the war.
It's interesting. I don't know much about the art world. Everybody on this call knows a lot more than I do. I'm actually involved a little bit in the opera world. I'm on the board of trustees of the Washington National Opera, and we have cooperate with this group called the Russian Chamber Music Association, and it's very funny. If you go onto their website, it says in big letters, the Russian Chamber Music Association is an American organization. We have no affiliation with Russia, and we are giving all our profits from this concert to help the people of Ukraine. And I just thought it was really sad. I mean, it's there's so many tragedies that are associated with this. Is probably a smaller one. But I did find it very sad that they had to put that up there. It was just, I don't know. There was something about it that I found sad that even the word Russian now is so toxic. And we have Vladimir Putin to blame for that. But it's a really sad situation.
It is a sad situation, Daniel, but it's a lot sadder what is happening in Kharkiv and Mariupol right now.
Yes. Amen. Completely agree.
Universities are asking themselves, what are the lines here that we have to think about? And, my first concern really is for the students, Ukrainian students and the situations they're in the States now. But I am worried if the world returns to the depths of the Cold War. I can remember a time when the first Russian students, when I got my MBA, and the very first Russian students that were at Yale in that program were part of it. And I learned a lot from them. I just worry that this sort of deglobalization is also going to be, it's going to spill over into the academic domain as well. And so anyway, Yale is, I'm sure every part of Yale is thinking through the situation for their students currently, but I just hope that it doesn't harm the long-term outlook for international exchange of ideas and movement of people and working together.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment, Will, and I I studied Russian economics and language and so on in the 1980s, and when this Cold War was still on, and I think that many of those steps that were made towards detente were incredibly helpful, including the cultural ones. But I think, Will, the assumption that we had, honestly, was a little bit like the assumption before World War I, right? That if countries had more cultural, scientific, and economic connections, conflict on a massive, devastating scale would become less likely. And I think that once again, that assumption has exploded, and we have to reevaluate, I think, particularly petrostates, because that's a petrostate with nuclear weapons here. That is really, really dangerous combination. And that, I think, is going to speak to, I think President Zelensky said, Marta, very powerfully when he spoke to the US Congress, we have to think about the international arrangements that allow countries to attack other countries and kill innocent people. And clearly the arrangements that worked for a while and actually got us through the Cold War more or less, those arrangements have failed totally. So I think that's first you have to stop the fighting and stop the killing of innocent people. Then I think, we have to reevaluate international arrangements. And I do think we should keep in mind what you're saying, which is we want connections between people. We want ideas to move back and forward. We in the United States and the West have nothing to fear and much to gain from that. But we can't go back to buying oil and gas as we've done in the past from people who will use it to rearm themselves under a nuclear umbrella that will allow them with impunity to devastate their neighbors and to drive 10 million people from their homes, as this is today, guys, that you've all seen, right? And it's still very far from over in my view, Marta. So I think, we have to reevaluate everything, but keeping your principles in mind, I think would be a very sensible thing to do.
From what you just said, it reminded me of what J.H. Hobson said before the First World War. His argument was that there would never be a giant conflict for two reasons. One is that in a sense, every country had their hand in every other country's pocket, that there was an integrated global market. And two, that there were these alliances that would prevent such a thing from happening. And of course, he was proven spectacularly wrong. So I agree with you that this notion that somehow we're safer because we've had a greater cultural exchange and economic exchange. I think it's been proven wrong sufficiently that we shouldn't take comfort in it. And I agree too that a new set of rules about who will deal with whom that's collectively enforced. We're going to have that, or just expect to go back to, the shards of the 20th century.
Thank you, everyone. I think that we're at time, and this has been a fascinating and I think a very productive discussion. I'm sure we could come up with other ideas and thoughts and observations in the hours ahead. Let's hope that we see this violence and aggression ending sooner than later. And thank you for all that you've done and the information. Molly, thank you very much for the cooperation, and peace.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thanks for staying up so late, Daniel.
Oh, yes. It is late.
This will be recorded and available.
Thanks, everyone.